So we'll continue our conversation. Last time we stopped at sonnet number 2. We tried somehow to compare it with Edmund Spenser and Sir Philip Sidney. Да, у меня коллеги подтвердили, что вы их слышите. Там, в компьютере. So, last time we spoke about the sonnets. Edmund Spenser, Sir Philip Sidney were Shakespeare's predecessors, as well as some Italian writers who lived long ago compared to Shakespeare. And we see that in Edmund Spenser's text there is a very obvious opposition of ice and fire, cold and hot, and that's the way the whole sonnet is written. So very little unexpected comes from the text if we read all those 14 lines. With Sir Philip Sidney, the sonnet is a little bit more complex, and we have the enumeration of things that the author is ready to sacrifice in order to have sleep. But again, there is no great complexity about the arrangement of the sonnet compared to what we find in William Shakespeare's texts. Text number 2, sonnet number 2, belongs to the initial 17 sonnets, which all of them deal with this subject of urging the addressee to marry, because if you don't marry at 17, obviously it would be too late if you do it some other day. But then, after sonnet 17, the obvious scheme disappears, and Shakespeare becomes much more original in what he writes. I spoke at length about the complexity of dating and attributing the sonnets. It all begins with the famous dedication, which some people misread, and where they find Mr. W.H. as the possible addressee of the sonnets. In fact, it was the person who gave the sonnets to the publisher, and he had got nothing to do with the actual addressee of the sonnets. But it's reasonable to assume that the sonnets at large were dedicated to the Earl of Southampton, who was the only known benefactor of Shakespeare. And after the first 126 sonnets come the remaining 28, where the Dark Lady, unidentified, clearly enters. And here the sonnets change a little bit their general orientation, because it's clear that they were written by the author who was more advanced in years compared to the first 17, for example, sonnets. And so now 2 examples of the sonnet belonging to the young friend category and the sonnet belonging to the young lady, the dark lady category. Of course, there are some logical oppositions present in the texts, but they're more diversified, I believe, than what we find in Edmund Spenser and Sir Philip Sidney's works. Being your slave, what should I do but tend upon the hours and times of your desire? I have no precious time at all to spend, nor services to do till you require. Nor dare I chide the world without an hour, whilst I myself watch the clock for you, nor think the bitterness of absence sour, when you have bid your servant once adieu. Nor dare I question with my jealous thought where you may be, or your affairs suppose, but like a sad slave, stay and think of naught, save where you are, how happy you make those. So true a fool is love, that in your will, though you do anything, he thinks no ill. Very tender, very warm text. The person who is addressed spends a lot of time not in the company of the friend, of the poet, but the poet does not mind, and his only preoccupation is to wait till the friend appears. Not at all complicated linguistically or logically, but at the same time obviously a masterpiece, because the tenderness of the text is superb, and he does not follow any clear logical themes, clear logical schemes, I'm sorry. The last sonnet to be discussed is sonnet number 138. It is addressed to the dark lady, and here again is some kind of logical opposition found, but it's quite unexpected how the author develops this idea that the lady says she's true, she's loving the author, and at the same time he has a feeling that she is lying, and the author probably thinks that he is young enough, but again it turns out to be false, and so falsehoods come from all directions, but it doesn't spoil the relation fatally. They continue to exist, lying to each other. Again, quite unexpected, and not something that you would find in the writings of the less intellectually sophisticated authors. When my love swears that she is made of truth, I do believe her, though I know she lies, that she might think me some untutored youth, unlearned in the world's false subtleties. Thus vainly thinking that she thinks me young, although she knows my days are past the best, simply I credit her false-speaking tongue, on both sides thus, as simple truth suppressed. But wherefore says she not she is unjust? And wherefore say not I that I am moved? Oh, love's best habit is in single trust, and age and love loves not to have years told. Therefore I lie with her, and she with me, and in our faults by lies we flatter thee. Of course, we're not going to read all those 154 sonnets aloud to each other, and the main aim of my explanation today was to show that Shakespeare's sonnets are really worth reading, that it is not the scandalous material to be studied in order to get some information about the author's private life. Rather, these are very elegant and subtle pieces of text, speaking about human emotions that are familiar to most of us. Some of the texts, of course, were more technically complicated and intellectually less interesting than the others, but on the whole, I believe it might be interesting reading for all those who wish to get a better idea of what Shakespeare's sonnets are actually like. So, last time we spoke about Shakespeare's biography, we said that having been born in 1564 in a family of a rather wealthy citizen of Stratford, a commoner, and his wife Mary Ogden, who was belonging to a much more glamorous family. Shakespeare lived in relative prosperity in his father's house because John Shakespeare was not merely a mayor of Stratford, but also a very successful merchant. Then came the years when he supposedly studied at the Stratford Grammar School since the age of 7 to the age of 14 or 15, and his young years were marked by the acquaintance with some theatrical companies coming to Stratford from London, when those companies went on tour, and it was his father who authorized the payments to the companies. So it's very unreasonable to suppose that Shakespeare's family were a collection of unlearned peasants. They weren't. The specific thing about the education in the grammar school was that the children were learning almost exclusively the Latin language and Latin classical literature, with some idea of ancient Greek, but it was not really properly taught. Ancient Greek would be taught at universities. And during those 7 years, the children memorized by rote a lot of examples of classical literature, and in this way, some kind of pattern would be created in the minds of the more quick-witted pupils, which would allow them later to use not only the Latin language, but to embellish the English language they were using according to the rhetorical patterns they had studied at school. And so Shakespeare was getting his primary education. The interesting thing about the Stratford Grammar School was that during the years that Shakespeare was studying there, during which Shakespeare was studying there were 5 school masters, one coming after another, and all of them were the graduates of Oxford. So we mustn't think that in that provincial place the teachers were unqualified. On the contrary, they were quite qualified. And another interesting thing about them is that mostly they were all Catholics, and one of them, John Cotton, had to retire because his elder brother was executed as a member of Edmund Campion's mission. So the Catholic connection is not difficult to find, and it would be there throughout Shakespeare's life, because at the very end of his career, in the year 1613, 3 years before Shakespeare's death, he bought a house in London, which he immediately leased to some prominent Catholic who was the servant in the Fortescue family, yet another collection of famous Catholics. And 10 years after the house was bought, it wasn't already Shakespeare who was the owner, because he died just 7 years before the actual event. What I'm talking about is the year 1623 now, and Shakespeare died in 1616. It was owned already by other people, but a very tragic thing happened there, which once again corroborated the Catholic connection of the place. The so-called fatal Vespers took place in the house. There was a religious ceremony at which about 300 people were present, and during the ceremony the floor went down, then the floor of the Others also fell down, and about 95 people were killed. If we need to explain the Catholic connection of Shakespeare's father and Shakespeare's daughter, Susanna, it's easy to see that the grandfather and the granddaughter were united by the beliefs of their son and their father, respectively, William Shakespeare, the son of John Shakespeare and the father of Susanna Shakespeare, who was married to John Hall, a local doctor, physician, and so when she was married, she was called Susanna Hall. The Catholic connection is significant not because we are now speaking about the difference in the religious doctrines as professed by Catholics and Protestants. What is significant in this case is rather the political implication. In England, it was impossible at that time to stay away from the religious conflict, and you either belonged to the new class of Protestants supporting the Queen and the activities of her regime, or you could become part of the dissident society, some of them more militant, some of them more tranquil, but again, it was impossible completely to stay away because this conflict was all-embracing. If you agreed to be called a Protestant, you had to visit the Protestant church regularly, and if you had other beliefs, it would cause an acute crisis of conscience, because when you are present at the ritual in which you do not believe, which you say is heretical, in this way you betray your God and you risk the salvation of your soul after you die. And there was not only this theological implication. When Elizabeth became queen, the country was mostly Catholic, and so those who turned Protestants had to cooperate with the government, who was actively looking for dissidents, for the priests coming from abroad, and for Catholic families ready to harbor a priest, ready to organize Catholic rituals in their own houses, and in this way to disobey the Queen in her desire to establish Protestantism in the whole country and to control the whole country administratively. A natural desire for a sovereign, of course, but when the better part of your population are not obeying you spiritually, the task becomes very difficult indeed. And so if you were a Protestant, you of necessity would have to report on your family and friends who remained Catholic. There were quite a number of Catholics ready to oblige, still remaining Catholic at heart, while still others did not want any kind of obedience. And here the horrible conflict within the society appeared. The more militant Protestants were against Catholicism, the more active Catholics were ready to organize various kinds of plots, while the less active, more moderate Catholics just wanted to be left alone. They didn't want to obey the Queen religiously, but at the same time, they did not want to obey the Pope of Rome and the Spanish king, who were actively thinking about organizing an insurrection in England in favor of Mary Stuart, they didn't want to obey the Pope and the King of Spain administratively. And here the conflict arose, which led some English people to some very extreme point of spiritual, emotional crisis. And this is in fact what Shakespeare's famous play, Hamlet, is about. For centuries, people have been trying to discuss why Hamlet did not want to kill the uncle, although he had every opportunity to do it, why Hamlet was procrastinating for 4 acts, although he knew from Act 1 that the uncle was guilty of Hamlet's father's murder, and at the very end of Act 1, Hamlet agrees that the uncle was a criminal. But then in Act 2, he begins to doubt it, and he says that as he has learned it from the ghost, and you can't be sure whether the ghost had been sent by God or by devil, he needs to check whether the ghost was lying on it. And then in Act 3, he checks it, he learns that the uncle was a criminal for sure, and again he doesn't kill that. So explanations begin as to why Shakespeare did not kill his uncle, who had been the murderer of Hamlet's father. And explanation number 1 is that he was a Christian humanist, he couldn't kill anyone at all, which contradicts the behavior of the prince in the play, when he kills Polonius, Ophelia's father, when he arranges the murder of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, and when he finally kills the king. So Christian humanism probably has got nothing to do with the prince's behavior. Yet another explanation is that Shakespeare wrote a play based on a play by some other author and based on some legends fixed in the works of Belfaret and Saxo Grammaticus, and that Shakespeare was not very careful about his plot. He took half of his plot from other people's texts, forgot to change it, then added something of his own. So the play is illogical because Shakespeare was a bad author. A very interesting explanation, but in fact the play is logical throughout, and Shakespeare introduces consistent changes in his source texts, while as for the previous play written by somebody else, presumably Thomas Kidd, Shakespeare's contemporary, it's manifestly absurd because no other play belonging to that author had ever been done. So again, it's a rather clumsy attempt to explain the inexplicable simply because people ignore the general historical context of the epoch, and when left without the possibility to use the most obvious explanation, they begin to invent explanations which are patently untrue. Yet another explanation of the Freudian kind: Hamlet had been in love with his mother, he was jealous of his father's relations with the mother, and when the father died, it was huge relief for Hamlet, and when father appears in the shape of a ghost, Hamlet doesn't want to follow his demands, simply because Hamlet never loved the father. And the fact that now the uncle is having sexual relations with the mother is not that revolting to him. Absolutely absurd, yet again, but an explanation which is quite popular among some people who are inclined to find sexual implications in literary texts. In fact, as Hamlet was universal and popular among Shakespeare's contemporaries. It was performed in the Globe, a big theatre owned by Shakespeare's company and by Shakespeare himself. And this theatre could accommodate some 2,000 or 3,000 spectators simultaneously. The structure of the theatres was the following. The structure of the theatre, there was a kind of wooden construction consisting of 3 galleries and a stage, and within the wooden construction there would be an empty space, unroofed. The galleries were roofed, of course, and in that space people were standing. They were called the groundlings, зрители стоячего партерра. The places were relatively cheap where you could stand, while the places at the galleries were much more expensive. So 2,000 or 3,000 people watching the play simultaneously probably would need some logic in what they were watching. Shakespeare's Hamlet is one of his longest plays. When played in full, it lasts for 4 or 4.5 hours, depending on the speed with which you are playing. And in Shakespeare's times, the play periodically would be interrupted by dances in order to amuse the public. So all in all, the play could last even longer than 4.5 hours. And so to imagine Shakespeare's contemporaries, some of them quite uneducated, watching the Freudian tragedy, or Christian humanist tragedy, or illogical tragedy based on previous texts, it's quite impossible to imagine those people watching it all, paying their money for it, because we shouldn't take them for complete barbarians. People were not stupid in those times, and there was the same proportion of stupidity versus non-stupidity as we find in our present-day society. Very little changes in our population if we speak about the intellectual capacities. So there had to be some logic in what those people were watching, and for them, plays would be very similar to our modern TV programs. They would not be expecting something absolutely abstract. They wouldn't be expecting the structure of a sonnet or a more complicated literary text to be read and not to be listening to. So, to be listened to. So, there had to be something generally very clear to the public. And that's the main context and the main conflict of the epoch consisted precisely in people being unable to make a choice between what is demanded from them by tradition, by their nearest and dearest. People were unable to do it, and at the same time they detested the ruling class, the administrative power in the land. And some of them would be suffering to the extent that they would be thinking about committing suicide. That's one of the very important themes that we come across in Hamlet. If we consider all this, and if we try to bring some order in that disorderly collection of interpretations, we will have to find the connection between the conflict described in the play and the key conflicts of Elizabethan England. And those key conflicts would be precisely connected with the society being split, with some people knowing what they wish to do, to fight the opposing faction, while a vast majority of people would be neither here nor there. They would find themselves between the two extremes. extreme Protestantism and extreme Catholicism. And their life would be probably even more complicated than that of the extremist-minded contemporaries and compatriots of theirs. And so there is nothing strange, in fact, about Hamlet suffering and procrastinating, and the greatness of the text is predetermined on the one hand by the greatness of the ideas presented in it, and also by the extreme technical capacity of Hamlet's creator, who had been working on this play persistently and consistently, practically during the whole of his life, and the copy we now possess, coming from the first folio and from the good quarter, goes back to the year 1604-1605, when Shakespeare from Stratford was 40 years old already, while the earliest texts familiar to us from the so-called bad quarter could have been written when Shakespeare was about 25. So at least 15 years of work done by Shakespeare, and witnessing to his great progress, his considerable evolution as a writer. Now let's have a look at the examples from Hamlet. Again, my purpose now is not to show the complexity of the ideas, but rather the mastery with which Shakespeare was depicting his characters and creating the play, which is much richer than its main character himself, but which is first and foremost associated, of course, with his great monologues. But the characters in the play, the less prominent ones compared to Hamlet, show again Shakespeare's power of characterization. He creates unique images of Hamlet's adversaries, and he manages to create those unique images not only thematically but also linguistically. So the first extract we have is the speech of Claudius, the uncle who had killed the father. He knows he's in a very difficult position because not everybody was ready to accept him as king. Hamlet, the son, was also a good candidate, and now he has to prove to the audience that there is no conflict between him and his nephew, and also he has to explain this rather awkward decision to marry his brother's widow several months after the brother's death. And so the king begins a rhetorically brilliant text, which is produced in a rather standard fashion rhetorically. We will see it's different from Hamlet, but it's no less impressive. Though yet of Hamlet our dear brother's death the memory degree, and that it us befitted to bear our hearts in grief, and our whole kingdom to be contracted in one brow of woe, yet so far has discretion fought with nature, that we with wisest sorrow think on him, together with remembrance of ourselves. Therefore our sometime sister, now our queen, the imperial jointress to this warlike state, have we, as 'twere with a defeated joy, with an auspicious and a dropping eye, with mirth and fervor, and with dirge in marriage, in equal scale, weighing delight and dole, taken to wife. What he has to say is, of course, I am very sorry for the death of my brother, but I decided to get married to his former wife, to his widow. But he has to make it sound impressive and convincing, because both things are questionable, and so he finds, of course, he also finds for him, Claudius finds this very rhetorical and pompous and probably convincing way of explaining his own behavior to the listeners. And then he speaks to Hamlet, saying that, of course, he should lament his father's death, but he should not go too far. "'Tis sweet and commendable in your nature, Hamlet, to give these mourning duties to your father. But you must know, your father lost a father. That father lost his, and the survivor bound in filial obligation for some time to do obsequious sorrow. But to persevere in obstinate condolement is a cause of impious stubbornness. 'Tis unmanly grief. It shows a will most incorrect to heaven, a heart unfortified, a mind impatient, an understanding simple and unschooled. For what we know must be, and is as common as any, the most vulgar thing to sense, why should we, in our peevish opposition, take it to heart?" So the idea is, Hamlet, you should join the public life, you should stop lamenting the death of your father, and then comes the rhetorical explanation. It's the natural thing for a son to lose a father. The fathers lose their fathers, so somehow we must stop, because it is unmanly and it's a kind of sacrilegious behavior. Of course, there might be difficulties in understanding the so-called unknown words, but if you get into the way of reading Shakespeare and understanding him, looking up words, probably taking the Russian translation, the better variants of it in order to understand the unfamiliar text. Very soon you will get into the way of reading Shakespeare without any reference material or turning to it only occasionally. And there is a lot really to appreciate in Shakespeare's text. So that's the beginning of the play. The very beginning is the scene when the gods discuss the appearance of the ghost, and they think that they should warn Hamlet that the ghost had appeared. And then comes the scene at the court when Claudius explains to Hamlet that he should be a good subject, a good nephew, a good probably stepson. And then comes the celebrated monologue by Hamlet, which he pronounces when everybody is gone. And it's the first monologue when Hamlet is already contemplating suicide. He begins to speak on these subjects before he learns from the ghost that the uncle had murdered the father. So there must have been some reasons for Hamlet to suffer. Here he accuses his mother of infidelity and frivolity probably and misbehavior. But as we will see later, it's not so much the behavior of the mother that upsets Hamlet, but the general situation. He would later feel unable to follow the ghost's demands, although he knows that these are just demands, and he would not be able to accept the new king whom he detests. So this famous monologue, not yet to be or not to be, famous because first Hamlet speaks about the mood he is now in, And then he begins to speak about the mother's behavior, the difference between the father and the uncle, and here the uninterrupted, complicated rhetorical periods finish, and Hamlet begins to speak in this abrupt way, showing Shakespeare's great capacity in varying his language. Oh, that this too solid flesh would melt, soar, and resolve itself into a dew. Or that the everlasting had not fixed his canon against self-slaughter. Oh God, God, how weary, stale, flat, and unprofitable seem to me all the uses of this world. Found, oh fire, 'tis an unweeded garden that grows to seed. Things rank and gross in nature possess it not. That it should come to this. And that was the part about the father. But 2 months dead, nay, not so much, not 2. So excellent a king, that was to this Hyperion to a satyr, so loving to my mother, that he might not between the winds of heaven visit her face too roughly. Heaven and earth must they remember. Why she would hang on him, as if increase of appetite had grown by what it fed on, and yet within a month let me not think on't. Frailty, thy name is war. A little month, or ere those shoes were rolled with which she followed my poor father's body, like Niobe, all tears, why she, even she, O God, a beast that wants this course of reason would have more blood, married with my uncle, my father's brother, but no more like my father than I to Hercules, within a month. Oh, yet the salt of most unrighteous tears had left the flushing in her galled eyes. She married, the most wicked speed to post with such dexterity to incestuous shrews. It is not, nor it cannot come to good. But break my heart, for I must hold my tongue. Quite a unique piece of poetry, in fact, blank verse, of course, when the character changes his initially stately manner of addressing himself or his supposed audience, and when those parts of interrupted thoughts, forming some little whole, of course, come one after another. And this being a contrast to the speech of the main characters, less significant characters, because it shows the complexity of the character's mind, the main character's mind, the richness of his emotions, and against this background, other characters either look primitive or cunning and primitive, but of course they can be compared in their intellectual drive and strength to Hamlet. Then comes again a celebrated monologue of Hamlet when he sees the ghost for the first time. Oh, that this too solid flesh would melt comes before his acquaintance with the ghost, so to speak. And then in scene 4 of the first act, Hamlet is invited by the soldiers to watch with him during the night, and the ghost appears yet again, and it says, or rather, it invites Hamlet to get to the other part of the platform at the Elsinore Castle, where they would not be overheard by the soldiers. And here comes the first reaction of Hamlet When he sees the ghost, he asks the ghost, "Why did you come? Why did you get out of your grave? Do you want to tell me something? Do you want to frighten me? What's the idea of your appearance?" Quite a brilliant text, different from what we had previously. Here the logical contrasts are presented, but it's not the logical contrast of the Edmund Spencer kind, lasting for 40 lines. It's much more modest and rhetorically convincing. So Hamlet is amazed and he asks the father, "Why did you come? What do you want?" Angels and ministers of grace defend us. Be thou a spirit of health or goblin damned. Bring with thee airs from heaven or blasts from hell. Be thy intents wicked or charitable. Thou comest in such a questionable shape that I will speak to thee. I'll call thee Hamlet, king, father, royal dame. Oh, answer me. Let me not burst in ignorance, but tell why thy canonized bones, hesed in death, have burst their sermons. Why the sepulchre, wherein we saw thee quietly inert, has oped his ponderous and marble jaws to cast thee up again. What may this mean, that thou, dead corpse, again in complete steel, revisitest thus the glimpses of the moon, making night hideous? And we fools of nature, so hurriedly to shake our disposition with thoughts beyond the reaches of our souls. Say, why is this? Wherefore? What should we do? Then Hamlet converses with the ghost in scene 5 of Act 1, and he comes to the conclusion that he has to kill the uncle because he's obviously a murderer. The father had been murdered by the uncle, so Hamlet knows what he should do. And then it comes Act 2, where in fact nothing happens. Hamlet is speaking to the actors, Hamlet is speaking to Ophelia, he is speaking to his former university friends, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, and here the favorite technique of Shakespeare comes to the fore. Everybody is not telling each other people, their real thoughts. They dissimulate, they lie, and they don't sometimes even know why they are lying, but they feel wary, they are afraid of the interlocutors, they don't know what would happen and what would follow. So everybody is not saying what he actually is thinking about. Here we have also an example from the father of Ophelia's, father's of Ophelia speech, addressed to his son very much the same way as Claudius addressing Hamlet. So here it's just an example of the more primitive kind of text Shakespeare was ready to produce, not because Shakespeare couldn't write properly, but because he wanted to represent a primitive character. And when people quote Polonius saying that's what Shakespeare said, of course it was said by Shakespeare, but it was said through the character who is detestable, rather stupid, and to say that Shakespeare gives advice to everybody is, of course, to grossly misinterpret what is said. So Polonius giving advice to his son who is going abroad. And these few precepts in thy memory, look thou character. Give thy thoughts no tongue, nor any unproportioned thought his act. Be thou familiar, but by no means false. Those friends thou hast in their adoption tried, grapple then unto thy soul with hoofs of steel. But do not dull thy palm with entertainment, of which new hatched, unfledged comrade. Beware of entrance to a quarrel, but being in, that the opposed may beware of thee. Give every man thine ear, but few thy voice. Take each man's censure, but reserve thy judgment. Costly thy habit as thy purse can buy, but not expressed in fancy. Rich, not woody. For the apparel oft proclaims the man, and they in France of the best rank and station are most select and generous, chief in that. Neither a borrower nor a lender be the famous pronouncement. For lo oft loses both itself and friend, and borrowing dulls the edge of husbandry. This above all, to thine own self be true, and it must follow, as the night the day, thou canst not then be false to any man. Farewell, my blessing season this interview. Not that stupid, of course. Shakespeare didn't write anything that would be rankly inadequate, even when he was giving these lines to a negative character, in some sense similar to the famous ballad by Kipling. If you can keep your head when all about you are losing days and blaming it on you, neither a borrower nor a lender be, as said by Polonius. So, quite different from Hamlet, based on those oppositions, predictable ones, but not entirely predictable. So, yet again, a specific way of making a character not just behave in some way, but speak in this way, stylistically representing the character with his more salient features. And so, let's return to Hamlet, the character. So, in Act 2, there is the massive dissimulation. Everyone is lying to everyone else, and the action does not really develop, with the exception of the fact that Hamlet needs the actors who come to Elsinore, and he hires them, he asks them to play in the court's presence, and more specifically in the presence of his uncle, a scene, a dramatic piece that would be written by Hamlet, and that would resemble the scene of his father's murder. Hamlet says, I'm not sure that the ghost is telling me the truth, so I will make this performance, and I will make sure that the king either reacts or not. If he doesn't show any emotion, it means that the ghost had been telling me lies. But if the king reacts, I will know what to do. I will have my revenge. But before the whole thing begins, Hamlet pronounces his very famous monologue, to be or not to be, in fact, developing the same scene he was first touching upon in the monologue from Act 1, Scene 2. Oh, there is too solid flesh would melt. And here Hamlet pronounces it, knowing very well that he is being eavesdropped upon by Polonius and the king. They're both listening, although they are not present. Obviously, apparently, they are eavesdropping, and Ophelia is there, actually listening. Hamlet is speaking in her presence. He knows that all the three of them are listening, but in fact, he is addressing Ophelia. And again, he speaks about this idea of suicide, probably to divert the listener's attention or probably at the same time to express his actual thoughts. So the interpretation is much more complicated than it would be if we had this text pronounced by Hamlet alone, not knowing that he is being eavesdropped upon by the king of Polonius and not addressing Ophelia. But as there is a tradition of interpreting this text as a piece of dramatic poetry, we have a lot of very unreasonable explanations and interpretations. In fact, it's not a poem, it's a piece from a play pronounced at a certain moment in a play in the presence of some characters, some of them apparently present, others hiding themselves but still known to be present to the main character. And so it's not just the piece of rhetoric concerning the futility of human life, it's the piece probably aimed at hiding his true intentions. But the piece, of course, is very powerful. It's another matter that it shouldn't be interpreted as some poem by Byron or as some sonnet by Shakespeare himself. Just have a look at the text and we will read it in a second. So, the idea of the monologue, which is lexically quite complicated, is generally quite simple. It's another matter that we ourselves very rarely, if ever at all, think about life along these lines. So, if you are dissatisfied with life, what is better, to commit suicide or to fight? And generally, the reasonable choice, according to Hamlet, of course, would be to choose death. And the only thing to prevent a person from committing suicide is the fear of what comes next if he commits suicide. Because there are so many unpleasant things a person has to bear. If we interpret the text just line by line, we would find it difficult to understand why Shakespeare brings together the oppressor's wrong, the proud man's contumely, the pangs of despised love, the law's delay. Why should the Danish prince worry about the law's delay? But if we think about the Englishman listening to Hamlet in the Globe Theatre, probably things would become easier to understand. So there are a lot of troubles in life, some of them clear only to Shakespeare's contemporaries, and it would be a natural choice for some people at least to commit suicide if it had not been for the fear of what comes next in the afterlife. And as you begin to think and your conscience starts working, you become weak, you begin to have doubts, and you prefer to continue living. So that's the idea of the monologue, probably the most celebrated of Shakespeare's texts and one of the most misunderstood texts by the great playwright. To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether it is noble in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against the sea of troubles, and by opposing envy, to die, to sleep, no more. And by sleep to say we end the heartache and the thousand natural shocks that flesh is heir to. 'Tis a consummation devoutly to be wished. To die, to sleep, perchance to dream, aye, there's the rub. For in that sleep of death what dreams may come when we have shuffled off this mortal coil must give us pause. There's the respect that makes calamity of so long life. For who would bear the whips and scorns of time, the oppressor's wrong, the proud man's contumely, the pangs of despised love, the law's delay, the insolence of office, and the spurns that patient merit of the unworthy takes, when he himself might his quietus smite with a bare bodkin? Who would fardels bear, to grunt and sweat under a weary life, but to dread of something after this? The undiscovered country, from whose bourne no traveller returns, puzzles the world, and makes us rather bear those ills we have than fly to others that we know not of. Thus conscience does make cowards of us all, and thus the native hue of resolution is sicklied o'er with a pale cast of salt, and enterprises of great purpose and moment with this regard their currents turn awry and lose the name of action. Soft you know, the fair filly, nymph, in thy orisons, thee all my sons remembered. A very powerful piece of rhetoric, of course, but not the one to be read as a separate poem. It's a text to be read within the context, the broader context of Shakespeare's play, and it's in fact no better than so many other parts of Hamlet, which, for historical reasons, for aesthetical reasons probably, are less familiar to the readers. And the scene which comes next is probably no worse or even stronger rhetorically and dramatically than the monologue we have just discussed. So Hamlet pronounces this monologue, again, to inform the king and Polonius that he's not dangerous. In fact, he's thinking of suicide only, and he's dissatisfied with life. He's not mentioning the misbehavior of his mother. The reasons he gives for suicide are sufficiently abstract, and so he is playing for time. Not because he has no chance to kill the king, but he's not ready emotionally. And at the same time, he understands that the king's intentions are quite vicious. He doesn't trust anyone around him. And before he comes to the conclusion what to do, whether to follow the ghost's demand or not, he needs time and he needs to protect himself from the king's malice. So he is playing for time to allow himself to come to some conclusion, not because he objectively has no chance to kill the king. Then comes scene 2 of Act 3, where the actors perform in the presence of the court a play which has a piece resembling the scene of Hamlet's father's murder. The king reacts accordingly. He is obviously shocked by the performance, and Hamlet now, even if he had doubts, now has the perfect right and perfect reason to go and kill the king. And in scene 3 of Act 3, Hamlet has this opportunity. He's going along a corridor in the Elsinore castle, and he sees the king who is kneeling and praying, and who is obviously shaken to the core by what he had seen previously when the play was performed by the actors at Hamlet's insistence. So the king can be killed now by Hamlet. He is not armed, but Hamlet produces a chivalric explanation of why he's not going to kill the king. Now he is praying, and if he is killed now, he will go to paradise, where the father was killed when he was asleep. He had no chance to confess his sin, so the father went either to hell or to the purgatory. So Hamlet will wait until the king is drunk or engaged in some sexual intercourse, and only then he would kill him. The explanation, of course, is not very convincing, but that's what Hamlet suggests as an explanation for yet another delay. But Hamlet, of course, knows that the explanation is worthless, and he is sufficiently troubled to look for an outlet for his very disconcerting and disturbing emotions. And in the next scene of Act 3, he comes to his mother's chamber. He hears the noise behind some curtain behind the arras, and he kills Polonius through the arras, Ophelio's father, the king's minister. So gone entirely is this explanation concerning Christian motives of Hamlet's non-action. He can easily kill a person. It's another matter that he doesn't want to kill the king. And why he doesn't want to kill him is easy to understand. First of all, he can't be sure that there will be no rebellion after the king's death, that Hamlet himself would not suffer. And in general, Hamlet would prefer not to obey any of his relatives. He doesn't want to murder the king for various reasons, and at the same time, he doesn't want to obey the king. So he would have much preferred if the father and the uncle had left him alone, and he can't make this choice because he knows that the fratricide, of course, is no good thing, but that political murder is fraught with dangers of itself. And so, being in that unstable state, he comes to his mother's chamber, he kills Polonius, and then he begins to educate his mother. He has too many things on his conscience to feel quiet, and he wants to show to himself and to his mother that, in fact, the most horrible thing for him at the moment is the mother's behavior. And so he accuses the mother, he introduces the portrait of his two relatives, the ideal image of the father, who is equal to all Greek gods simultaneously, and the image of the uncle, which is confined just to a couple of lines. Here Shakespeare violates this parallel manner of presenting the material, and in this way he again becomes very different from what we had in the sonnets, especially in those by Spenser and Sidney. And then he continues his lecture, saying that as his mother is an old woman, she's about 40, probably a bit older, at that age, of course, you don't think of physical relations. So the fact that she got married to the uncle should be explained by some kind of paralysis of all feelings. It's entirely unnatural. And so first the queen, when she's listening to him, tries to interrupt him with some brief remarks. She's shocked. She thinks the son is mad. He has just murdered Polonius. Maybe he's going to murder her. So the mother first tries to interrupt him, but then in the middle of the monologue, she says, "Yes, I understand. What I have done is atrocious. Stop this, I can't bear it any longer. Stop speaking to me, have mercy upon me. I understand I have committed a terrible sin, a terrible crime." But Hamlet continues. Now he's describing the uncle as a thief, as a murderer, and again the mother says, "Stop this." And then the question arises how the playwright should continue the scene, because the emotional level is such that you don't quite know what to do with it. Either everyone becomes hysterical and the curtain falls, or the mother should lose consciousness, and Hamlet would be standing above her. A very intricate situation when emotions are at their peak, and a more ordinary playwright would not know what to do. Not so with Shakespeare. Suddenly the ghost enters. Hamlet stops his rhetorical exercises altogether. He can see the ghost, the mother cannot. And suddenly, losing all his emotional, hysterical intentions, he asks the father's ghost, why did you come? And it turns out that all along he knew that by lecturing to his mother, he was simply trying to postpone the thing that the ghost demanded from him, the murder of the uncle. And Hamlet knows that the ghost had been perfectly right to the murder. And then the ghost also pronounces a couple of phrases. The mother is shocked because she sees that Hamlet is talking to what she thinks is an empty space, but in fact there is the ghost whom she doesn't see. And the ghost explains to Hamlet that, of course, he had come to remind Hamlet of his duty. And then it turns out that the ghost, the father, is still in love with the wife, or at least he has pity on her, and he orders his son to comfort the mother, to stop shocking her with his words, to stop the emotional torture he had been engaged in producing. And after that, Hamlet, quite reasonably and convincingly, begins to speak to his mother in a more moderate way, and the emotional peak from which no other author would have found such an elegant way out is somehow overcome, and the scene continues. I love that piece from Hamlet. I'm ready to recite it for any amount of time, for any amount of times, and I think that all in all, it's no less powerful and probably even more powerful than this famous monologue to be or not to be. So Hamlet first abuses his mother, and the scene begins with her phrase, "What did I do that you dare to speak to me like this? What have I done that thou darest wag thy tongue in noise so rude against me?" Such an act that blurs the grace and blush of modesty, calls virtue hypocrite, takes off the rose from the fair forehead of an innocent love, and sets a blister there, makes marriage vows as false as dice's oaths. Though such a deed, as from the body of contraction plucks to the very soul, and sweet religion makes a rhapsody of words. Heaven's face does glow, yea, the solidity and compound mass, with trustful visage as against the doom, is sword-sick at the act. Ay me, what act that rose so loud and thunders in the index? Look here, upon this picture and on this, the counterfeit presentment of two brothers. See what a grace was seated on this prow. Hyperion's curls, the front of Jove himself, an eye like Mars to threaten and command, a station like the herald Mercury, new lighted on a heaven-kissing hill, a combination and a form indeed, where every god did seem to set his seal to give the world assurance of a man. This was your husband. Look you now what follows. Here is your husband, like a mildewed air, blasting his wholesome brother. Have you eyes? Could you on this fair mountain live to feed, and batten on this moor? Have you eyes? You cannot call it love, for at your age the heyday in the bloody stain, is humble and waits upon the judgment. And what judgment would step from this to this? Sense sure you have, else could you not have motion. But sure that sense is apoplexed, for madness would not err, nor sense to ecstasy was ne'er so thralled that it reserved some quantity of choice to serve in such endeavors. Whatever was that thus has cozened you at Hoodman blind, eyes without feeling, feeling without sight, ears without hands or eyes, smelling sense all, but a sickly part of one true sense could not so mope. O shame, where is thy blush? Rebellious hell, if thou canst mutiny in a matron's bones, to flaming youth let virtue be as wax and melt in her own fire. Proclaim no shame when the compulsive ardor gives the charge, since frost itself as actively does burn, and reason panders will. O Hamlet, speak no more. Thou turnest mine eyes into my very soul, and there I see much black and green spots as will not leave their tint. Nay, but to live in the rank sweat of an insemined dead, stood in corruption, hunting and making love over the nasty sty. Oh, speak to me no more, these words like daggers enter in mine ears. No more, sweet Hamlet, a murderer and a villain, a slave that is not 20 spots the ties of your precedent lord, a vice of kings, a cutpurse of the empire and the rule, that from a shelf the precious diadem stole and put it in his pocket. No more, a king of shreds and patches. Save me, and hover only with your wings, you heavenly gods. What would your gracious figure? Alas, he's mad! Do you not come your tardy son to chide, that lapsed in time and passion? Let's go by the important acting of your dread command, O speak. Do not forget, this visitation is but to where they almost blunted birds. But look, amazement on their mother sits. O step between her and her fighting soul. Conceived in weakest bodies, strongest ways. Speak to her, Hamlet. Here I will stop talking, telling you about the tragedy. The aim was twofold. In my talk today, I tried to give an explanation of the whole meaning of the play and to explain the illogicality of the play, which in fact is quite logical. And the second idea was, of course, to show the greatness of Shakespeare's text and to advertise it in order to invite you to read it in the original and hopefully enjoy this masterpiece of Shakespeare and of the whole English dramatic, poetic tradition. Next time we will continue and probably finish our conversation about William Shakespeare. We will need the texts of the two handouts, Venus and Adonis, Richard II and the Merchant of Venice, which I have sent to you for this class. Thank you very much for your kind attention.